Taxidermy. Whether it fills you with curiosity, delight, or gives you the heebie-jeebies, the practice has experienced a revival in the past decade. From Mashable, The Guardian, Artsy, to The Daily Beast, or even on Portlandia,
Dead pets.
media has relished depicting twee hipsters who are getting reinvested in this storied craft. Well, not actually as storied as many believe. Although taxidermy textbooks from the 1950s tried to historicize the practice, as going back thousands of years to the ancient Egyptians, animal mummification was a far cry from taxidermy today. Historically, this practice dates back to the 18th century, in which the largely anonymous artist-scientists populated the cabinets of wealthy natural historians and sportsmen with preserved specimens. Giovanni Aloi, author of Art and Animals and Speculative Taxidermy, both of which are relevant later in this video, pins the genesis of taxidermy, that is, in a form that somewhat resembles the practice today, at around 1803, when the term taxidermy was coined. Pieces existed before that, but not in the quantity or quality to consider it a coherent practice, or even the resulting products of it taxidermy. While early taxidermy pieces were used as taxonomical, physiological, anatomical, and even artistic references, the practice itself remained at the margins until the mid-19th century, the great age of popular taxidermy, when instructional books became more widely available and the practice gained popularity. The rise of taxidermy was in concurrence with colonial domination of the 1800s and 1900s, by which the physical, in-the-flesh evidence of faraway, exoticized others could be preserved and ogled by Western audiences. By the turn of the 20th century, Carl Akeley, the father of modern taxidermy, reimagined the final product of the craft. Instead of individual animals in sterile rows of glass cabinets, the Akeley method preserved animals naturally, in families or life groups, and set them within artificial landscapes among other species of plants, birds, and insects. Donna Haraway, in Teddy Bear Patriarchy, Taxidermy in the Garden of Eden, writes about the Akeley African Hall of Mammals, particularly the gorilla display, which, even in adhering to a naturalist aesthetic, mobilizes narratives of race, class, and gender that are specific to the time of its creators, reiterating organicist hierarchies in the process. Sportsmanship here manifests as masculine domination over an animalized other. There is an organic bodily and social sexual division of labor, and never an aged or deformed beast. Taxidermy declined in popularity in the mid-20th century. Associated with hunting and burdened with colonial history, taxidermy came to be considered morally suspect, as exemplifying, both symbolically and materially, European domination over nature and non-Western others. Cal Chauvin, 2018, page 36. In the decades following, the craft was relegated to the realm of folk art, mostly practiced by an overwhelmingly male rural population that were largely hunters. But something strange happened in the mid-20th century. Taxidermy emerged as a medium that aimed to produce neither trophies of individually hunted animals nor specimens of scientific value, instead as a piece of art. And strangely, unlike other crafts that have entered the art world, taxidermy found its way into the gallery space not by an aesthetic refinement or mastery of skill, but by a violent undoing thereof. In 1954, artist Robert Rauschenberg saw an Angora goat in an antique store, a creator of combines, part painting, part sculpture, receptors upon which objects are scattered, upon which data is entered. Rauschenberg went through several iterations of working with the goat to incorporate it into his abstract aesthetic in Monogram from 1955 to 1959. The resulting piece is the first instance of what Steve Baker calls botched taxidermy in his book The Postmodern Animal, published in 2000. In direct opposition to the visually gorgeous and attractive menagerie of Edward Lucy Smith in Animals and Art, pieces of botched taxidermy are fractured, awkward, wrong, or wronged things that render the animal abrasively visible. They are questioning entities. They undo meaning and form. When I think of form, I think of this quote from Hegel. When I give form to something, its determinate character as mine receives an independently existing externality and ceases to be limited to my presence in this time and space and to my present knowledge and volition. That's page 85 of Elements of the Philosophy of Right. When a taxidermist gives form to an animal, it reflects the historical, cultural, and aesthetic values of the taxidermist's time and positionality. Whether the ultimate aesthetic is naturalist, whimsical, surrealist, or abstract, form and semiotic meaning are imposed on the animal material, and it ceases to be limited to the taxidermist's presence in time and space. Baker achieved what he intended to do with the text, that is, call attention to animals and their representation as a legitimate subject of critical inquiry for art historians and critical theorists. 20 years later, the fields of animal studies and art have engaged in lively and fruitful discourse, resulting in a great deal of novel inquiry, including the magazine Antennae, launched in 2008 by Giovanni Aloi. Botched taxidermy as a movement, Baker argued, was marked by a shift from artwork as botched to artist as botcher, in an intentional act of making, unmaking, hybridizing, dividing, etc., largely towards the ends of making wrong. However, the postmodern underpinnings informing Baker's idea of botched taxidermy as a wrong or wronged thing have lost their relevance. Postmodernism is jaded, cynical, and tired, and brings little substance to the conversation. It is in opposition to, but rarely is. Under the layers of irony and cynical meta-narratives, even Baker admitted in 2016 that there was a need to move beyond botched taxidermy, because the field of animal studies and art has changed, and different conversations were to be had accordingly. But the core assertion of Baker's analysis remained true. Animals in art are important to think with, and there's something significant about animal materials, surfaces, and their disruptions. Taxidermy has risen as a sculptural medium with a unique ontological niche, straddling the binaries of life and death, art and science, and nature and culture. It is dead, but looks alive. It has been reconceived as an artistic practice, but it is a practice inextricably informed by taxidermy's taxonomic history. It is a presentation of something natural, but only looks that way because of human intervention. The animal is present in its skin, but it is stripped of any internality. The skin, the surface, is reconfigured into new contexts and bears new meanings and signs. In Baker's 2016 lecture of the same title, he speculates how to move beyond botched taxidermy. As he reflects on his intentions with the concept originally, he takes issue with the normative leanings of wrongness, his emphasis on anti-aesthetics. He says that the work that lies beyond botched taxidermy calls to be understood as a purposeful project with its own dynamic and momentum. He says, the disregard or disavowal of beauty is an act of failed generosity, drawing from the work of Elaine Scarry. Baker doesn't present any clear answers for what exactly might lie beyond botched taxidermy, but he suggests that this new movement produces works that are made with confidence, respect, and have a forward momentum. Giovanni Aloi, who I've mentioned earlier, suggests that the field that lies beyond botched taxidermy is speculative taxidermy. In his words, the term speculative taxidermy therefore defines a category of actual taxidermy objects or indexical representations of them that first and foremost pose questions about what taxidermy may be or do in order to unravel complex interlinks between humans, animals, environments, discourses, and practices. He also says that visible animal skin, or its representation, is critically adopted as a defining indexical relationship between animal presence and the medium of representation itself. Like botched taxidermy before them, pieces of speculative taxidermy are questioning entities, but specifically in his emphasis on new materialism, Aloi suggests that they must pose questions about what taxidermy can be or do, hence the speculative, imagining taxidermic pasts, presents, and futures. And they must contain an indexical presentation of an animal skin or surface. They must speak through semiosis of that skin. Speculative taxidermy takes direct influence from Jane Bennett's vital materialism, in which objects are agential actors embedded in networks of agency. Even though they aren't alive, objects have thing power and can influence humans and others with their will. If you, as Jane Bennett did, stop to wonder whether a rat in a drain pipe is alive or dead, you come to realize that it doesn't matter much. The matter itself is important, agential, and there, looking the same way, contributing to the same mood of the drain pipe, and being a substrate for parasites or fleas. Aloi suggests that animal objects, like taxidermy, can only agentively engage in meta-narratives of representation through the vital materiality of their presentness of the animal skin in some capacity. However, I argue that this precludes many opportunities for non-humans, and not just animals, to represent themselves, and not just with their material presences. Non-humans can represent themselves and their agendas in other ways beyond their material presences. The wielding of semiotic signs is not exclusive to humans nor living things. Taxidermy necessitates an indexical representation of significant otherness, ideally on the terms of and in the language of those others. Aloi is already cognizant of the agency of both animals and objects, which I commend him for, but I aim to 1. Expand the authenticating factor or grounds for indexicality of speculative taxidermy to beyond animal and beyond skin. 2. to widen the biopolitical register of speculative taxidermy to be open to cosmopolitical and geontopolitical complications. And 3, suggest new ways of acknowledging and working with the agency of objects beyond their material presences, specifically by listening to them. In Situated Knowledges, Donna Haraway thinks about objectivity and suggests embodied objectivity, a notion that avoids the pitfalls of both unembodied radical constructivism and female critical empiricism that fails to consider processes of production. She puts forth the idea of the material-semiotic actor, an idea which is, in her words, intended to highlight the object of knowledge as an active, meaning-generated axis of bodily production. The object, quite literally, of knowledge here is the piece of taxidermy. It is an active, agential, and meaning-generating, and those meanings are produced and constructed. Critical attention, Haraway says, and I concur, should be turned to those processes. Part of what makes Haraway's concept so effective is its double emphasis on both the material embodiment of things and their processes of production. So starting with her idea of the material semiotic actor, I uncreatively divide my inquiry into a tracing of the processes of production of animal relations and object relations that precede taxidermy's actual material, and then I interrogate the semiotic dimensions, the symbolically and semantically charged fields in which taxidermy gives, receives, and confers meaning. Aloi is aware of Haraway's premise of the material semiotic actor, but he fumbles it, suggesting instead that the viewer of taxidermy is the material semiotic actor, and only mentioning the concept in passing. It seems that despite his emphasis on new, vital materialism, Aloi ignored some ways which we can understand taxidermy as active agents, physically present in the gallery space, and with the help of some other theorists, I hope to expand that register. In Why Look at Animals, John Berger asks, why do we look at animals in zoos, movies, toys, etc.? The answer, he concludes, to his eponymous question is, we have no other option. Under capitalism, we are so far removed from animals that we can only look at them, not interact or otherwise actively relate with them. We look at them from behind ontological membranes, screens, aquarium tanks, museum diorama glass, which divides our worlds. In her response essay, Why Look at Dead Animals, O'Brien suggests a similarly uneasy meaning. Because we are detached from death, especially our own, we look at animal death, slaughterhouse films, doomed nature documentaries, taxidermy, but it stands in, metaphorically, for our own. For Berger, we are alienated from animals, so we look at them. For O'Brien, we are alienated from our own deaths, so we look at the deaths of animals as a stand-in. The killing of animals is a difficult topic, and it differs based on context. For instance, in her writings of goat sacrifice in India, Radhika Govindarajan describes how intercorporeal violence, namely sacrifice, gives meaning to interspecies relationships. Since goats can be sacrificed in lieu of humans, thus saving a human's life, the very act of sacrifice is the substrate for theoretical identification between species. Is this the case for hunting animals of taxidermy? No. But I bring this up because I want to emphasize that there are different ways of relating to animals and animal death that problematize any sweeping assertions of good or bad animal death. Going into this essay, I was originally curious about the ethical parameters by which taxidermists understood their practice to be ethical, and I ultimately abandoned that route because of the consistently predictable responses. Taxidermy is ethical if you do not kill it, if you can find it, if you can get it secondhand, but you cannot be directly complacent in its death. This recalls a very Kantian ethics. The practical imperative will thus be the following. So act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. That's on page 41 of Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Although Kant did not recognize the agency of non-human actors like animals, I think this still is applicable, insofar as the animal life is regarded as disposable, usable, a mere means towards an end of making an animal a preserved object. The life of a buck, for instance, shot with the intention of being mounted, is effectively being deemed inferior to the will of the taxidermist. I also think with Hegel here, to appropriate something means basically only to manifest the supremacy of my will in relation to the thing, and to demonstrate that the latter does not have being for and in itself, and is not an end in itself. That is on page 76 of Philosophy of Right. So let's break down some of these different relationships with animals, relationships that ultimately influence the way taxidermy is positioned. In Modes of Being and Forms of Predication, Philippe Descola details 4 ways of relating between humans and non-humans. First, animism is a continuity of souls and a discontinuity of bodies. Totemism is a way of relating by which attributes, physical or mental, are shared between humans and non-humans. Analogism is predicated on distinction between all beings. Things can only be compared to one another if there is another. Naturalism, our own ontology, is the opposite of animism, a discontinuity of interiorities and a material continuity. We share the same physical world as animals, but our souls are entirely distinct, mutually unintelligible. Taxidermists of the non-artistic kind, so those who make trophies or dioramas, reflect the dominant Western ontology, prescribing to naturalism. Naturalistic or naturalism is also how you describe the aesthetic, like nature.
You probably thought this deer was alive, and this coyote was alive, and this pheasant was alive. Nope.
Taxidermy can be analogizing. Writes Descola, analogy becomes possible and thinkable only if the terms that it conjoins are initially distinguished. When animal bodies are figured to represent something else, to become symbols in the larger human schema, not only are their bodies being appropriated towards our ends, but they are reasserting the distinction between human and non-human. Take the work The Cat and the Dog by Jordan Baseman. It's the prepared skin of a dog and a cat pinned to the wall with sculpted foam heads, and it is uncomfortable. But Steve Baker said it best. To learn that the piece is, according to the artist, a metaphor for marriage and a response to his own unhappy childhood experience of family life is to know too much, and to reduce to mundane knowledge this effect of far from mundane image. Baseman approaches taxidermy with an analogizing approach, predicated on differences between human and animal existences that allow them to stand in for one another. While, to go back to the original example, the relationship between a goat and its owner in Govindrajan's text is colored by a much more animist flavor. Taxidermy is more unsettling from an animist or even totemist perspective. The animist because humans and non-humans have the same interiorities, but those interiorities are impacted by their embodied perspectives that mediate their ways of living with the world. It's the body of something that thinks like we think. Chloe Brown and her bewitched taxidermy is perhaps the closest equivalent to a Western imaginary for an animist perspective here. She tries to make the taxidermy of bewitched humans trapped in the bodies of animals, and I can't unsee it. In the Companion Species Manifesto, Haraway ditches the phrase companion animal in favor of companion species because of its more mutual verbiage. Anna Singh goes even farther and suggests fungi and plants are also companion species. Haraway invites us to coexist with significant otherness of non-humans. Animals, like our dogs, are different than us, and that's okay. We all should relish the difference because we co-evolved that way, and mutual contradistinction requires contradistinction. Doing so, she explains, often requires us to learn the language of the other and do it on their terms. In a similar sense, I think taxidermy embodies an opportunity to coexist with significant otherness, or to mold it to our own will. Here, let me think with taxidermy. Certain taxidermists like to draw attention to animal issues through the medium of animal art by anthropomorphizing their subjects in ways that humans recognize: faces, tears, bodies, clothes, positions, human traits, in order to arouse affect, such as Kate Clark. Ideally, we should be able to see taxidermy without being mediated by human semiotic modes, like faces, that allow us to see emotion through them. We're still going to be seeing it mediated by the taxidermist, which makes this whole thing a lot messier, but a recurring theme I'm trying to emphasize here is the production of human-animal relationships and the way interspecies communicates, complicates, and gives it meaning at the same time. On page 168 of Speculative Taxidermy, Aloi says that the field of anthropology only sees animals as immanent measurers of otherness, which is an assertion I think is challenged by recent work in the interspecies and ontological turns of anthropology. But it isn't just animals. As I already mentioned, Anna Singh's mushrooms as companion species expands the purview of interspecies relationships to include non-animals like fungi and plants. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. Phylogenetically, the lines between animal, plant, fungi, etc. are not all that distinct, and there's no reason that if we're bringing up animals to the table, we shouldn't bring plants, fungi, or even bacteria or other prokaryotes. Non-humans should include all life, but then, what is life? In Why Interspecies Thinking Needs Indigenous Standpoints, Kim Tallbear takes issue with the premise that any non-life exists at all. Life is not a distinct part of the universe, she says, but something that flows through all creation. Quoting Charles Eastman, who is also Dakota, the tree, the waterfall, the grizzly bear, each is an embodied force and as such an object of reverence. This understanding of the world makes clear what Western ontologies sometimes unnecessarily complicate with Cartesian duality and subject-object distinctions. Taxidermy fundamentally troubles these divides, and is much more conducive to being thought with via Tallbear's frameworks. As Latour is paraphrased by Stephen Palmier in Wizards and Scientists, the very tendency of categorical separation invariably calls forth the hybrids that such schemata must disperse or repress. But, much like the analogism of Descola, this breaching of binaries is predicated on the existence of those binaries in the first place. That being said, Palmier talks about the peculiarly pre-constructed semantic density in the stunningly hybridized artifact of a mutilated corpse. In his example, it was the body of Charlemagne Perrault, the leader of the Cacos Rebellion, who was executed, nailed to a door, and photographed. So here you might ask, if no non-life exists at all, what are the conjoined hybrid elements of a mutilated corpse? Does it not straddle life and death? Kim Tallbear once again provides us with the answers to that question: de-animacy. In Caretaking Relations, Non-American Dreaming, she puts forth the idea of the animacy hierarchy, by which certain beings are de-animated as forms of stripping power from them. It is easier to see as animate things that communicate their existences to us in ways we understand, and animate things, unlike de-animated things, require our love, attention, care, and active relating to. De-animated things are possessible. Animated ones are much more difficult to possess. For instance, Tallbear talks about how settler self-indigenization, by which non-natives claim to be indigenous, is a form of de-animating indigeneity, by relegating native blood to the status of something ownable, an object, as opposed to the result of active engagement with and relating to those communities and entities. So you can probably tell where I'm going here, since all things and materials are living in some capacity, animated by their own vital forces of vital materialism. Taxidermy isn't necessarily uncomfortable in its hybridity of life and death, or not life and non-life, but its hybridity of animacies. Taxidermy reanimates and deanimates in different, sometimes conflicting ways. Realistic reanimations are largely predicated on visual affinity to the creature in life. But what that reanimation is really doing is halting the natural forces that would otherwise take over the animal. I would argue de-animating the forces of decay. Even though it reanimates a recognizable non-human other, an animal, taxidermy de-animates and renders impotent the vital forces that are mobilized by bacteria, insects, mold, and other non-humans. It is easier to own something if it is de-animated, and that is what taxidermy does. I cannot own or even begin to account for the forces at play in decomposition, and decomposing taxidermy is taxidermy gone wrong. Even outside of the normative roots of the idea of wrongness that Baker criticizes, decay renders the thing taxidermy no longer taxidermy. It's failed taxidermy if it decays. And here, I think, is where Giovanni Aloi's argument comes apart at the seams, if you will. Biopolitics is an undoubtedly helpful concept to think with, but its reassertion of life-non-life dichotomies does not play well with Tallbear, nor does it do justice to the actual hybridity of animacies in animal objects of taxidermy themselves. So the question is, what lies beyond the biopolitical? In Geontologies, a requiem for late liberalism, Elizabeth Pavanelli suggests the term geontopolitics as the new, more inclusive register. She includes the living and non-living as united in the same systems of power and existence. For instance, in the global carbon cycles, life and non-life in their various animacies get blurred and hybridized, and whether you're alive or dead in the scope of the whole system doesn't matter all too much. You're still carbon. Pavanelli also discusses geontologies in practice by discussing Aboriginal Australian relationships to Durgalmo, or fossils, who are sometimes revealed following geological phenomena. The manifestation of a Durgalmo is a self-evident embodiment of the entangled existences, the material mutuality of humans and non-human others. They communicate their presences and are listened to. In a slightly different route, Marisol de la Cadena sees cosmopolitics as the remedy for linear biopolitics. Cosmopolitics expands the purview of geontopolitics, which is bound to the planet. Cosmopolitics instead opens itself up to multiple divergent worlds that hybridize into beings that are more than one and less than two. Okay, record scratch, freeze frame. I have a few questions. How do fossils fit into our interpretive schema of taxidermy? Aloi's assertion that taxidermy is an indexical representation of the animal is met. There is a print of a non-human left behind. The other was there. But the key thing is that these fossils aren't explicitly being deployed to speculate on taxidermic pasts, presents, and futures. The Durgalmo manifested for other reasons than the anthropocentric goals of questioning forms of human art and its representation of others. However, if I were to present or indexically represent a fossil with the intention of asking questions about taxidermy, yes. Aloi considers even photographs of animals or their skins as speculative taxidermy. Why should their interiors, revealed by vast interspecies communities working towards its decomposition and fossilization, population not get the same attention? It is an indexical animal or non-human surface. The other is present, even though it is not the skin or outer surface of the animal, the form recognizable to us. Although fossils can give us insight to what the creature looked like, these appearances are not always immediately available and must be constructed, debated, and changed in accordance with new evidence, in communication with the bones themselves. We must listen to the fossil record to reanimate them correctly. Fossils, although indexical of the animal body, even if a part of the body not visible to humans, are not necessarily iconic of that which they represent, and bad dinosaur recreations testify to that. Keeping this in mind, I argue that the indexical presence of the non-human in taxidermy should be expanded beyond animal and beyond skin to include non-animals and other indexical representations of vital matter beyond that which is visible and recognizable to the human, whether internal, like bones, or nebulous and invisible, like forms of decay, as long as it is deployed with the explicit intention to comment on the meta-narratives of indexical representation of the other as Aloi intended. Without the final stipulation that speculative taxidermy must comment on taxidermy, the purview of what taxidermy is becomes too wide. However, that question runs us into a brick wall of anthropocentrism. How do we invite non-humans to the table to speak about representation and taxidermy? We have been implored by previous authors to listen to non-human others, but how do we do that, and how do we make the conversation about representing them in our own, very distinctly human forms of art? It builds to a bigger question. If things have wills or agencies, as Bennett says with vital materialism, and can also be violently de-animated by us, as Tallbear says, how do we ethically treat them and give them the power to be animated on their own terms and in their own languages? I suggest we listen to them in their materiality. Tallbear, in a coincidentally, if not intentionally, very Latourian sentiment, says that there is no social distinct from the material realm. That's the material in Haraway's material-semiotic actor, grounded in its very beingness, the very thingness. The material-semiotic actor participates in semiosis, communication, and not just the language we humans are used to, and we have to learn that language in order to treat them on their own terms. As Levi Strauss said, pictured here with Monkey, we are bricoleurs wielding and imposing signs from our own contexts onto others. We must break free from the imposition of our own language onto unwilling others. Michael Sipek's There Might Be Blood warns us the repercussions of noticing but not listening to non-human others on their own terms. Eduardo Cohen suggests the way to listen to non-human others is through a revitalization of traditional semiosis, beyond the human articulation of signs and symbols. Signs are how we understand the world, and since non-humans cannot deploy these signs through what we understand as communicative language, we must look for these signs in other ways. Following Haraway's emphasis on the production of the material-semiotic actor, the processes of doing and undoing the taxidermic form are also often sites by which the animal object communicates to the taxidermist, the viewer, and beyond. Recalling previous distinctions of ethically relating to non-human others, the processes of working with them often results in intimate knowledge and mutual communication. Aloi calls this the biopolitics of working with, but of course I hope to expand that purview into geontopolitics. In Tatiana Chudakova's Plant Matter, she talks about how the practice of Tibetan Buddhist Emki making medicines from plants is a type of world-making, but not a world-making of just the Emki's volition. It is an act of attention, which she describes as an ethical orientation and a relational practice. Similarly, the attention of the taxidermist is an embodied practice of relating with its own ethical orientation. Geographer Merle Pratchett stories the practice of taxidermy with historical research and ethnographic investigation, concluding that over time, taxidermists have increasingly worked with their subjects, using smaller tools to allow them to work more intimately with and following the material bodies of their subjects. Similarly, in Gestures of Taxidermy, Morphological Approximation as Interspecies Affinity, Petra Tishki-Kalshoven positions taxidermy as a relational practice, whereby affect, the shared capability for semiosis, allows for taxidermists to genuinely relate to non-humans, both through shared homology and significant difference, that they are comfortable and familiar with, and then adopt them in their own bodies. In both of these examples, embodiment of the practice of the taxidermy figures as importantly in listening to the materiality of the subjects. This is why I take issue with taxidermists who outsource their work, like Thomas Grunfeld, in which the will of the artist, the idealized form, is disconnected from the working with of any actual animals. Taxidermy's animal-human relationships are not only predicated on the cultural animal-human context, but the embodied practice of the taxidermist and her time with the animal body. This is more speculation, but I think there's another way that we can also listen to taxidermy beyond the semiosis, although incorporating semiosis, the frequency of hybrid worlds. Rachel Poliquin in The Matter of Meaning in Museum Taxidermy says, the animal objects talk to us, specifically through their excesses of significance, or in her words, of thingness. She says that taxidermy pieces exist simultaneously in distinct semiotic and interpretive fields that have their own internal logics and symbols. I suggest these are worlds. The four she identifies, which I think are poorly named and obfuscate their true discursive value, are 1. Descriptive readings, which center on the taxidermy object as an icon of species type, a member of a non-human species being, to steal a Marxist term. It's an animal. Biographical representations center on the taxidermy object's objectness, a material thing with its own history, such as my previous discussion of Rauschenberg's goat. The third reading, which she calls cautionary tales, but I think a more appropriate name would be cultural readings or metaphorical readings, is how the animal objects exist in human discourses and are mobilized for human symbols. And then finally, experiential readings describe what cannot be described by the other three categories. It's the moment of communion that Donna Haraway suggests is felt when you see a dramatically lit diorama. It is synergistic, hybrid, fleeting, visceral, and often incommunicable. It is this which De la Cadena means with her multiple divergent worlds, which come together through partial connections and result in aggregates that are more than one but less than two. In their resistance to being understood and represented in just one field of interpretation, their multiple, often hybrid worlds of significance synergistically collide to let the animal object talk. Is this perhaps the first step towards a cosmopolitical taxidermy? A taxidermy situated in hybrid worlds, privy to divergent worlds beyond traditional human understanding? I don't know, but I think it's one of the many ways to listen, or at least to start. By listening to the worlds of taxidermy, we can see that materials are agential, have wills, and participate in processes of semiosis in ways that might not be immediately visible to us. By tracing the processes by which our relationships to both animals and objecthood, we can get a sense of both the vital materiality of the taxidermic material-semiotic actor and the ways it is deployed in semiotic fields and or asserts its own meanings. I also hope to have contributed to the speculation on taxidermic pasts, presents, and futures with my suggestion to move beyond the rigidly biopolitical and rethink our representation of non-human others beyond animals and beyond representing their surface-level skins as the only authenticating factor of indexicality. I would love to end this video with a surefire example of a speculative taxidermy that embodies what I'm arguing for here, but the fact of the matter is I don't think any of the sort exists yet, or at least I'm not aware of it, and if it does, I doubt it's cognizant of these additional dimensions that I propose, or that it even considers itself taxidermy. I want to end, though, with something that I think gets close, or we can at least use to think with in order to imagine cosmopolitical or geontopolitical taxidermic futures. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with a show called Oddities, which followed an antique store in Greenwich Village that specialized in the macabre. They had an in-house taxidermist, Ryan, who took custom orders, and this one clip has stuck with me for years, originally unsettling, and now, I think, a lot more creative. The customer, Dave, was heartbroken when his two beloved cats died. He buried them in his backyard and later, unable to let them go, exhumed their skeletons and kept them in bags in his attic. A few years later, he decided to get their bones arranged so he could keep them on display, and that's where the show begins. What Ryan chooses to do with the skeletons, however, shocked me as a kid and ontologically fascinates me now. Ryan arranges the first cat, Zaja, in the form of a naturalist aesthetic, a fully articulated skeleton in the animated pose akin to the cat in life. He notes how the bones were so well picked, so well decayed, that he had to tea-stain them to give them the antique feeling that Dave was probably looking for. This is not the cat that shocked me, but it stands in contradistinction to it, engaging in the preconceived aesthetic meta-narratives for a faux antique look, staining them to hide the way that the decay actually looked, which was the bones being picked clean. For Dave's second cat, Ava, however...
Missing a lot of stuff.
Oh no.
But her skull was in immaculate condition, however. Okay. So I decided to do a different type of preparation that I think works. So,
well, let's see.
You got that? It's very, very fragile. You ready?
I'm ready. I'm
really
nervous,
ready?
but I'm ready. I don't know.
This is now Ava.
Oh my God.
This is what's referred to as an exploded cat skull, or an exploded Ava skull at this point.
That's a little disturbing.
Is it disturbing?
I think Exploded Ava's skull tells a story, or more specifically, lets the materials tell their stories, the stories of their production, and the interspecies network and non-organismic forces that worked with this animal surface. Ryan does not tea-stain this skull. It is stark white because it is stripped of its biomatter by insects, plants, and molds, and later heat and age. Its darkness speaks to the intensity of the decay, which in turn kind of justifies the question, where's the rest of the cat? The earth ate it. It washed away. Like how taxidermists often employ dermestid beetles to treat their surfaces, this intensive decomposition also affords Ryan the ability to work with the skull, highlighting and rendering exterior the delicate interior worlds of the contoured bones inside of the skull, a surface we humans are usually not privy to, but which non-human entities and forces work with. It is the surface by which a dead cat is recognizable to a maggot, or to a dandelion root, or to groundwater. It is the surface those forces work with and have decided to show us. Because the skull is in such good condition, so picked clean by a network of forces, it can be shown to us. Considering decay holistically is a geontopolitical endeavor. It involves living and non-living actants, forces and vital materialities with their own wills and intentions. Tracing the forces that led to Exploded Ava's skull requires us to slow down and take serious consideration of these non-human forces and their worlds. Its pairmate, Zaja, stands in opposition to it, and I would say the two together speak to a meta-narrative on the presentation of animal surfaces that successfully expands Aloi's biopolitics of working with into a geontopolitics of working with, while keeping in mind the taxidermic pasts that preceded it and inform it, however consciously. Or maybe it's just fucking creepy.